Hello and welcome to Earthcast, a platform for discussions about bridging the resource gap between people and planet. I am Olivia Taylor, or Olivia Earth on the socials, your host, and I will be interviewing a series of change makers, thinkers and disruptors, and asking them about their areas of expertise. Together, we will discover fresh perspectives and the most useful levers in society for change. The main question that we will explore is how are trade-offs made between people, planet and profit? More specifically, how do we solve wicked problems and make decisions at the margin? If you would like to hear more from Earthcast, subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Thanks for joining us at Earthcast today. I will be speaking to Yusuf Omar, who, like me, comes from Durban, South Africa, but he has far more traveled than I am. Yusuf has hitchhiked 12,000 kilometers from South Africa to Syria, or Durban to Damascus, which took him 3 months, where he told stories using only a small camera. So, who is Yusuf? Yusuf Omar is a co-founder of #OurStories, which is a global video publisher reaching millions of people daily on social media platforms. #OurStories have empowered over 10,000 trained mobile journalists across 140 countries. However, Yusuf's career started with the more traditional route and was the former CNN social media reporter. So Yusuf, you've won international acclaim as a multi-award-winning journalist and have spoken on TEDx, and not to mention worked as a correspondent documenting wars in Syria and Congo. So where is the hardest country that you've had to get to as a mobile journalist, or Mojo?
Thank you so much for doing such great research, Olivia. That was a great introduction. Without a doubt, the most difficult place that I've worked has been Syria. In 2014, I traveled there. I was working for ETV at the time, and I was smuggled into Syria with Gift of the Givers, which is a non-profit organization who were tasked with building a hospital in the province of Idlib, in a town called Darkush. And we made our way in through Turkey. I had a cameraman with me with the big broadcast equipment and all that kind of stuff, the satellite to be able to, live stream and all of that, which was, something we couldn't use at the best of times because it would become a target for artillery fire. And I think even in that location with the broadcast camera and the camera operator and all that, I still resorted to using my phone a lot because it was discreet, it was intimate. I could get personal moments lying in bed, being able to hear, ammunition's exploding nearby. But Syria was definitely the scariest thing I've ever done, the riskiest, something I wouldn't do again.
So when you plan for these trips, like going into Syria, Yusuf, how do you think about capturing the best angle? What really makes a top news story? And perhaps even, would you mind explaining how the algorithms work? I know that you work a lot on Instagram, and how our browsing affects what we see.
Yeah, 100%. So in terms of what makes for a good story, I think different organizations have different parameters depending on who their audience is primarily. At the #OurStories, we've really worked hard to refine what is and isn't a #OurStories piece. And like when we started, and it was just my co-founder and I, it was pretty easy. We had a good idea of what we wanted to do. We wanted to do stories about people changing the world. We wanted to check people's prejudice and deal with taboos and stereotypes and find local innovations to global solutions. But as we grew the team, and now we're like 22 full-time people, it's grown a lot faster than we could have imagined. It became harder for people to know what is a story that we do and what we don't do. So we had to end up creating like a framework, a checklist of things. And if the story ticks those 6 or 7 boxes, it is a story that we would tell. And if it doesn't tick those boxes, it's not. So in answer to your question, we can be quite specific with what kinds of stories we do. And the kind of checklist is as follows. 1, we look for stories that are genuinely surprising or unique. If we do an environmental story and it's about a ice cap melting and a brown looking polar bear, that's not unique, nor is it surprising. It's the expected climate change story. So it's not something we would do. The second question is, does it have suspense in it? Is there stakes that have to be discovered throughout the narrative? Is there an arc to that story? Is something that we're really interested in. The third is it solutions orientated? We don't just want to know that, global sea temperatures are rising. We want to find innovators or people doing something about it. The fourth is it visual? Does it have compelling visuals? Does it make something that makes for interesting video as opposed to a podcast or as opposed to a written piece? The fifth is it relatively recent? Did this happen? Is there a clear why now? Or is there a reason that we're telling the story now as opposed to 6 months from now or 6 months ago? What's the recency? The next thing, the sixth thing is it factually accurate, right? Is it substantiated and backed by facts and figures and information that we can fall on? And finally, 7, does it feature unheard voices? Does it represent a diverse community? So that answers your question on like what kinds of stories that we do and how we decide what kinds of stories we do. And speaking to your second point about algorithms and understanding what makes platforms like TikTok, Snapchat or TikTok or Instagram dance, and they're all different. They're all super unique. The audiences are different in each one, and the way these algorithms work are different. But what I will say is, across all of them, there's nuance. Like Facebook is based on shares and that kind of stuff. But across all of them, I think the biggest priority right now for many platforms is watch time. It's not just about somebody watching 2 or 3 seconds of a video, but like a platform can tell if a piece of content is good and meaningful and informative, and based on how long people are watching for, whether you can keep an audience retained for 60, 70, 80% of the video, which is difficult. It requires you to really engineer that video in a particular way that increases watch time. On television, you'd watch the full package, but on social, your thumb is so quick to scroll past. So I think the algorithms, in one word, if you had to focus on one thing, I think in 2021, focus on watch time. Focus on increasing the amount of time people are watching your video for.
That's so interesting that you say that. I recently had a chat to someone who was explaining that the whole way that music is going to be produced in the 21st century is going to change because of TikToks and Spotify, because you have to retain your audience for as long as possible. So that's always super interesting. But Yusuf, why, obviously you don't go by this term, but you've got the following now and you are an influencer. But why are other influencers who now have this kind of platform, why are they not posting about the important things, given their platforms and their exposure? Why, what is the I guess the barrier? What is holding them back from posting about this stuff?
It does frustrate me immensely that, some of the biggest influencers and talents in the world, their content is made up of very aspirational at best and this like exotic celebrity lifestyle of helicopters and boats, and like even without any consideration for the work that goes behind that. And I see so many videos on YouTube of like, I bought everything in this store, or like, and it's a complete opposite of what we're talking about. It's overconsumption and the promotion of that. The short answer why influencers and talent these days don't often focus on the important issues is because they're difficult. They're not sexy topics. They don't make for a good share. You have to work a lot harder to tell an environmental story in an entertaining way as you do to tell, something that's more clickbaity and more emotional and more evocative. Not to say that you can't. You've just got to find really surprising and unique and amazing characters and superb innovations that are, tangible and that you can see and feel. But I think it's harder. I think it's much harder. And I think it's harder to do anything that's constructive, that's focused on solutions. It's easy to point out problems. Even in the news space, forget the influencers, just the media landscape. It's easy to say like this is wrong. It's much harder to say it's wrong, but here's a bunch of different ways we can make it better.
Yusuf, you were in a TED talk. You did a TED Wexford talk in 2017. And you made a comment that good storytelling is more about voices and more perspectives, and that traditional media is not creating trust. You also say that mobile storytelling can mend this problem. Please will you break this down for me and explain why you say, mobile storytelling or using your phone can mend this?
Yeah. So I understand the point of view that many people that, the democratization of media and people being able to publicize their voice with phones has a dark side. It can lead to, false information and fake news and all of that. But I'm also fully aware as somebody who's been in traditional media landscapes, how much they lack diversity, right? In terms of sexuality, in terms of race, in terms of religion. So you have these newsrooms that are trying to cover their countries or the world, but they don't have the diversity within their organization to begin to understand it. And that came through, especially with the US elections, right? We thought Trump was going to win because journalists were more educated, more wealthy than the average American. It happened in the UK with Brexit. Nobody thought Brexit was going to happen. It happens in South Africa. The media are continually surprised when the EFF make political gains. They can't understand why rhetoric around nationalization is so popular. And yet, if they had more diverse newsrooms, they would have a better idea of what's happening, right? They'd have a better representation of voices. So I believe that more angles, more perspectives is more truth. Having more voices gives us a better idea of what's happening. Research has always been about, if you have research on any subject matter, having 1,000 sources providing information is surely better than one source. Giving you more perspectives on that. If a fire is burning, I often say in this room right now, would you trust one camera or would you trust 100 cameras showing it from different angles? I imagine you'd trust 100 cameras, even if the one is a professional storyteller. So that's why I say that I believe more angles, more perspectives, and especially the world that we're heading into now where, we have deep fakes, we have the ability to manipulate video to the extent that you can't even really trust that it's real. Having lots of perspectives on that video is definitely going to help us make sense of the world. I believe if we had more angles and more people recording, everything would go down. Corruption would go down. Rape would go down. I think all of these crimes that we see, especially in South Africa and around the world, it would be a lot more difficult to do it if we had a lot more transparency. And transparency can be achieved through people documenting the world.
That's a really interesting perspective. And I do agree with you that the rise in better tech and having mobile phones has really helped us capture. I know that there's a big perspective that, everyone's going, oh no, things are getting so much worse. And, the comment from a lot of people like us is, actually it's just being caught on camera now. It's always been happening. So
quite right.
For people like us, I sit on the cusp. I'm a 97 baby. So I'm a Gen Z. I'm not actually a millennial. But how do millennials and Gen Zs want to be communicated with today?
I don't think they're in the same bracket. I think the nuance of a Gen Z of your generation is fundamentally different to mine. I think Gen Zs have, according to a lot of research, consume content a lot faster than anybody else. Within 2 or 3 seconds of any stimulus, they've grasped whatever message there is to be had there, and they want to move on to the next. And that's why you see, being able to summarize big, complex stories within a 1-minute TikTok, for example. I think Gen Zs are also more aware. They're more politically aware. They're more woke, for lack of a better word. If you take the US context, for example, you find the first generation really of young Americans that recognize that their country is not the greatest in the world in so many measures, in education, in healthcare, and previous generations didn't feel that way of Americans. They often were very much, they believed that they were the American exceptionalism, that they were exceptionally better than everyone else. So I think all in all, Gen Zs and millennials to some extent too are more aware than everyone else, the generations before. And in the context of environmentalism and climate change, for me, that's the most important thing. I remember watching an interview with Greta Thunberg and Trevor Noah, and Trevor Noah asked her, what's the greatest singular impact that any individual can have to save the planet? And she's basically said, being more conscious. And I do believe Gen Zs are more conscious than those that came before them when it comes to saving our planet.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I do feel that there has been sort of a global consciousness shift that is happening, and however small it might be to start, I do feel that there is something happening. So Yusuf, how have your perspectives changed on Africa as a continent after experiencing so many new countries from your mobile journalism and traveling? You know, I've mentioned you're from Durban. What was your biggest realization or perspective shift after traveling to all these new countries?
I left for this Durban to Damascus journey in 2010 because I wanted to see what was called the dark continent for myself, and you know, big, bad, scary Africa. And I think the biggest singular learning is that South Africa is dangerous. The rest of the continent is not. Most of the countries in Africa look at South Africa like this, like dangerous younger brother, you know, who's just coming to grips with itself and is a very young country. But like, I only had positive experiences on the continent, especially on my trip up East Africa. I felt safety and warmth, and I saw growth and opportunities, and you know, some of the fastest growing economies in the world lie in the African continent. The United Nations often speak about the future having an African accent. An enormous market of over, you know, a billion people, and over 300 million middle class people. As a market for people that are trying to tap into opportunities. We have a same middle class as the US as a continent. So totally still untapped, still totally uncharted. And I think it's going to take brave new minds with new ideas that are gonna find the opportunities. Like, and it's already happening, as you know. I mean, like on my trip up the east coast of Africa, I saw massive investments being made by the Chinese, and that has continued over the last decade. And of course, there's lots of opinions like for and against that. But I think Africa is finally shaking off this negative blood diamond image that it's had for generations, and people are actualizing that you know, there's incredibly functional democracies, there's incredibly safe countries, there's young and hungry people that are looking for opportunities, and we see those young people come through in the stories we tell every day. The innovations that we see coming out of Africa is like nothing we've ever seen before. I mean, just in the last couple of months, we've done, especially in the recycling context, stories of guys in Kenya who are turning bones from beef into jewelry, tires into furniture. In Tanzania, we did the story on the woman who was training rats to smell for landmines, which they then send off to other parts of the world. You know, in South Africa, we see incredible efforts at releasing marine life back into the ocean, like turtles. In Kenya, we told this incredible story of this woman that had come up with a wig that was made out of plants instead of plastic. Obviously, a lot of wigs around the continent are made of plastic. The most, like I never even imagined that there was a problem, a pollution problem of wigs made of plastic, and it's a huge problem. And that's the beauty of Africa, is that in our resilience and in our kind of determination, we find these like really innovative solutions to problems people haven't even imagined yet.
No, that's absolutely true. And yeah, I think when you start to think about all the different problems out there, it can be really, really overwhelming. And that's what I really like what you're doing, which is highlighting the positive stories, because there is an overwhelming amount of negativity. So it's to really choose to focus on those positives. That, I don't know, huge kudos to hashtag our stories for that. But I wanted to ask you,
following on from your point about those many problems. There was one of the people in one of our stories we just put out. Her name was Serena, and Serena was building robots that helped to fight, save the Great Barrier Reef, to help the Barrier Reef make babies, basically. And she said something quite interesting to me. She said that saving the planet against these, you know, sometimes insurmountable challenges is not about one person doing everything right. It's about millions of people coming together to do the right thing. And I think that's the big impact that content can have and media can have, is we can make viral videos that go viral, that reach millions of people. We can be part of creating that global consciousness. And that consciousness and that behavioral shift that audiences make arguably has a bigger impact than any policies that can be implemented or any technologies that can be designed simply by people doing the right thing.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And I'm really fascinated to see where the power of the media today, how that is shaping, politics and geopolitics in 10 years time. It's going to be really, really interesting to see that.
Definitely.
So I want to ask you a slightly different question. And there's a term that I've heard being thrown around recently called eco-anxiety, to be exact. And there has been some controversy around this term. So I wanted to know, do you think eco-anxiety is a condition of more privileged people?
No. I think privileged people may have eco-anxiety, and I think we should all have a level of eco-anxiety. I think we should be shitting our pants on some level about the imminent, catastrophe that's looming. But I think that the people that are really bearing the brunt of the environmental issues are farmers on the ground, are people that are having years with poor crops. It's people that are walking 3 times as far as they used to access water. It's communities that are no longer able to fish in the streams that they once had access to. It's tribes in forests that are now being cut down. I think that's the real anxiety. And yes, their anxiety is interwoven with their economic independence and ability to put food on the table. But as you know, it's the global south and more specifically the poorest countries in the world that are being hit hardest by climate change and are least responsible for it too. So yeah, I think there is a buzzword around eco-anxiety that exists within, a very liberal, left-leaning corner of the internet, and perhaps it's legitimate and perhaps it's warranted in some respects. But I think that there's certainly not the most anxious about environmental issues. I mean, Syria is a perfect example. Like, the Syrian civil war was started because of discontent against the dictator, but there has also been a lot of research to suggest that you had farmers that had a few years of bad crops, and that caused a lot of anxiety and turmoil in that region as well.
Perhaps my question should have been slightly different then. Perhaps the term eco-anxiety is something that we know everybody feels, but perhaps it's the phrase and the use of it now and who's using the phrase, and the fact that no respect has been given to people who are currently dealing with climate change. It's not this impending doom that might happen in the future. Along the tropics in Africa, things are already happening, and the huge problems already being seen. So perhaps I should have asked you a better question, but thank you.
No, I think, I think you're quite right. But the thing is, I mean, it's being seen there, but it's also being seen in everyone's cities, right? I mean, like, no matter where you are in the world, in the last 2 to 3 years, you've seen the headlines where we've recorded the hottest summer ever, the coldest winters. I really do believe this is like, we're going to be looking back at, our kids are going to be looking back at footage of these years and be like, what were you guys doing? Like, all the warnings were there for all of you. You were all experiencing, you all should have been more anxious, but you certainly have the signs right there.
Yeah, that's really true. Absolutely. I guess a healthy dose of eco-anxiety then for everyone is perhaps needed for this global consciousness shift we were talking about.
Yeah, to start treating it as a crisis. Yeah,
absolutely. Yusuf, I know you've been involved in numerous initiatives to empower people. Some we've already spoken about through #OurStories and through other types of digital activism. Please, will you share with us some of those examples? I want a feel-good story here. Tell me something that you are really proud of that you've been involved in.
Yeah, I've been really, really privileged to meet communities all over the world and empower them to tell stories with phones and even wearable camera glasses. I mean, most recently during COVID-19, we sent camera sunglasses out to communities around the world to tell stories through their eyes. And the stories were beautiful. We met, like, for example, this father and daughter duo in the UK who were creating elaborate balloon sculptures for the NHS healthcare workers during COVID-19. We saw another Filipino baker in San Francisco who was baking these colorful bread and then throwing them out of his balcony window for frontline workers to take to the hospital and that kind of stuff. We saw in South Africa people that were feeding thousands of people who were homeless during the pandemic. And all of these stories told through their eyes with cameras on their faces. So really, and what I love about that is the old saying goes, walk a day in somebody's shoes to understand, their world and to get a framework for who they are. And I believe that's really true. I believe, especially at a time where it's hard for us to visualize the impacts of climate change, for example, being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes is really valuable right now, to see the world through their eyes and say, whoa, like I see this problem playing out, on the banks of the Niger Delta, and I can be a part of that change in New York City. I can lobby against fuel companies, and I can be part of that. So we're going to be investing more and more in that space. One of the big examples I give of training specifically and how it's benefited people is when we're working in India. We trained a group of garbage collectors, waste pickers, how to tell stories with Instagram stories. And we didn't hear from them for like 9 months. They didn't use their skills at all. And we thought maybe they don't have time or data, or, wasn't a good training. The Indian government then raised the taxes on recycling plastic. In fact, it was at one stage prohibitively expensive to recycle plastic, to the extent that it was just cheaper to buy new plastic. And overnight, these guys, their livelihoods had died because they were in the business of recycling plastic. They then suddenly started using the training that we'd given them, and they started hashtagging waste GST. And Indian media picked up on this, and they started amplifying their stories. And through the work of environmentalists and people like you and lobbyists, the Indian government actually reduced the taxes on recyclable plastics. So for me, that was a great opportunity to see how training an unheard, marginalized community to tell stories with phones is something that they can call on when they need it most, when they feel they're completely ignored, when they feel like their human rights are being infringed on, and they can use that to make a difference.
Thank you so much for sharing those stories, Yusuf. It's incredible to hear what your team of only now 22 have been able to achieve. So I know that it's just, I'm in awe really of what you guys have been able to do. It's a really lovely story about the waste pickers in India.
Thank you. We're hiring. So if you have listeners that are interested in this kind of work, we are aggressively trying to bring more people on board.
Brilliant. Well, I'll let them reach out to you on Instagram at Yusuf Omar SA if they are interested. So
awesome.
But Yusuf, I want to ask you, as a mobile journalist or a mojo, where have you had to make trade-offs between documenting perhaps social concerns, environmental trade-offs, and making a living? We've all got to live.
So we've always been razor focused on being able to sustain this. A lot of media companies around the world are propped up by very wealthy business people, often men, that have other companies that they use their media as a device of influence, but not really profitability. Or you see players like the BBC or Al Jazeera that are funded by taxpayers' money or from the state. To be a self-sustaining and profitable media organization is hard. So I think we've been razor focused on platforms that would generate ad revenue. So we didn't grow a massive audience on Instagram or Facebook because we weren't making any revenue there. We were razor focused on Snapchat. That was and has been our primary source of ad revenue. So we've been focused there. I don't see that so much as a trade-off. I think that's actually been a really exciting opportunity. They value high quality journalism and fact checking and verification. And in that respect, we've had complete editorial independence. I do think when you are playing in that space where you are, ad-based revenue, you have to be very careful that that doesn't influence your editorial diary too much. You risk being in a position where you're like, hey, stories about this does really well, so let's just only do stories about that because we want to, turn up the money. I think you need to have shades of light and dark. You need to have balance. You need to do stories that might not perform that well or make that much revenue in terms of total viewers, but you think is really important to tell. And to do that, you have to distance your business team from your newsroom so that there's no influence. And you have to remove any kind of your metric. You can't have your reporters incentivized purely by views. They need to be incentivized by something more meaningful. So that's one part of things. Then you've got branded content, and that means where we work with organizations and produce content with them, right? So, and in that respect, we've had a very clear mandate from the beginning, and that is we will only do one. We'll clearly label something that's branded as advertised, as paid for. So you'll never watch a piece of content and be like, oh, was this or wasn't this paid for? But more importantly, we will only do branded content on stories that we would do anyway. So you will never see hashtag our stories do a cigarette ad. You'd never see us even try and sell a car. That's not who we are. We would do a piece, and some of the examples of pieces that we've done, we would do a piece with World Vision and train refugee communities to tell stories with their phones in northern Uganda and Colombia and Venezuela. We would do branded content partnerships with the United Nations to create awareness about the Sustainable Development Goals. We do work with ShopRite, where we did Africa's biggest cleanup, where we helped their staff tell stories about how to clean up the continent for Nelson Mandela Day. We do stuff with World Skills around like the best plumbers and electricians and how to incentivize skills. So I think that's how you stay true to yourself and maintain your values. You say, okay, we're not going to do paid content of stuff that's outside of our mandate. We'll only do stuff that we would do even if we weren't getting paid. I think that's really important. I think where we could have been better and smarter, one is travel. I flew a lot over the last 3 years, and I'm only starting to come to terms with the kind of carbon footprint that we've created in trying to build this network and train these communities around the world. I think now COVID has made us a lot smarter about being able to train communities via webinars and even using augmented reality tools and technologies, like being able to prop up a series of questions on the screen that we can use to interview people. So I think there's a lot of work that we are making in that space, and we've learned our lessons in terms of being more environmentally conscious as an organization about how much we fly and how much we travel. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and thanks so much for your time. And for those of you listening, you can find Yusuf on Instagram at Yusuf Omar SA. Yusuf, I have one last question for you before you go. Given your expertise as a mobile journalist and having traveled all over the world, what question should I have asked you?
When I ask people questions, I always ask them if there's anything else they'd like to say, and they often end up filling that void with something interesting. I suppose a question that is useful to ask, and I'm happy to answer, pertaining to media and more broadly every industry, is where I think this is all going. What does the media landscape look like in 10 years from now? And how do environmentalists prepare for that? How do media organizations prepare for that? How do communicators prepare for that, to communicate whatever message they have? It's very important that I think about this stuff a lot, about where the future is going, because we're building a media organization and we're laying down train tracks, and you don't want to build train tracks for where people live yesterday or today. You want to build for where they live tomorrow. So in 10 years time, by 2030, we believe yourself and me and most of us will be experiencing the internet through a device on our face all the time, a wearable computer. And the internet will be layered onto your world. So you'll look at a tree and be able to tell what tree it is, and you'll be able to look out and see which directions you need to take to get to where you need to go. And you'll look up at the sky and you'll see the weather report. That's where we believe the future of media, technology, and people is going. In order to build for that future, where we can create content for that like immersive landscape where you are really immersed into stories and present at the same time, we are investing a lot in camera-based technologies. So we are really, really focused on, if the old hashtag Our Stories was Yusuf and my co-founder Samaya traveling around the world training communities how to tell stories, the new hashtag Our Stories is being able to enable them with tools, whether it's the ability to blur out their face, whether it's the ability to administer advice for COVID-19, like, don't touch your face, or like, if you're going to sneeze into your elbow. But we're really, really, we even did a lot of work with the United Nations to be able to develop ways to survey young people and ask them questions about how they feel about our planet. So I think we are developing for the camera today, because those technologies that we integrate into the camera today will have us very ready for when you have a camera on your face looking out at the world tomorrow.
Thank you for joining me today at Earthcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review. Let's chat next episode, where I will be asking more creatives and intellectual disruptors about making decisions at the margin. See you next time.